To start our watercolor techniques, we need our mixed media sketchbook, our watercolors, paintbrush, water. We're also going to be using a little bit of salt, tissue or paper towel, and some plastic wrap or saran wrap. It needs to be plastic. To begin, we're going to create 6 shapes. Next, we're going to label them with our different techniques. All right, so the first technique that we're going to do today is a wash. A wash is a flat, even application of color. So we need to wet our paintbrush to use the watercolors, and we're going to pick a color, any color. I'm going to create a green wash today, so I'm just very gently putting my wet paintbrush in the paint. I'm going to dip in the water again. I want a little bit more water on this. Nice and wet. Do not dig into your paint. Take care of your paint. Love your paint. And then you're holding your paintbrush like a pencil, and you're always going to pull the brush. You never want to push it because we don't want our bristles to get all gross like this. It's bad. You got to re-dip in the water to take care of my brush and get a little more paint. So right now, this very uneven application of color is not what we want. A wash is going to be flat and even. So without getting any more water or any paint, I'm just going to push the paint around very, very gently. If you notice, I'm only using the tip of the paintbrush to do this. Flat and even. Now, between colors, we need to rinse our brush. Now we're going to start a layered wash. So before I go to my layered wash, I'm noticing my paper is starting to kind of crinkle here because I applied too much water and I need to fix it. I have some pooling. So before it dries, I'm going to get as much excess water off my paintbrush as possible. And very, very gently, I'm going to pull that paint across again and into areas that are light. I want an even application of color. Okay, the layered wash is going to take some time, so we're going to do one wash of color, let it dry, and then do another. So now that we know how to accomplish a wash, I'm going to start with red. And since this is a diamond, I picked a great shape to do a layered wash in. I'm going to actually paint the facets of the diamond. All right. So I'm going to be layering 3 times just to show you the full effect of a layered wash. This is a nice even coat of red. I'm going to let that dry, rinse my brush. All right, for wet on wet, You are applying wet paint onto an already wet surface. There's two ways that you can do this. The first one is using a clean paintbrush with just water. Apply the water to the paper. And then find a color that you want to use. Remember, be gentle with your paint. Do not dig. And then just touch. And if you watch carefully what happens, the paint is blooming and growing. It's going into the water. This is a chemical reaction. It's science. So, and if you notice, now that I'm pulling the wet paint onto the dry paper, I get a hard line instead of a smooth blend. So the other thing you can do with wet on wet, I'm going to change colors. Rinse your brush. Dab off any extra water. And then I'm going to put another color inside of it. I'm going to get red this time. A little more water. Need to activate the paint. And I'm going to put a drop of color in the already wet area. See? And so it blooms and grows. And so you get a really cool effect when you're painting wet paint on an already wet surface. And you can apply this in any way. It's a great way to blend as well. Now remember, mixing red and blue, you get violet. And move on to salt. For the salt technique, we want to have a nice wet surface with plenty of color. The salt technique works best with darker colors, so no yellow orange, and probably not yellow green. We want something a little darker. So I'm going to go for a red orange here. Activate my watercolor by getting plenty of water in there. Very gently lift that color into the paintbrush. And paint. Now, the salt technique works best when the paint is wet. And not just best, it doesn't work at all if the paint is dry. So you have to apply it pretty quickly before your paint dries. But do not add too much water because the salt technique is another chemical reaction and it will not work if there's too much water and not enough color. And vice versa. If you have too much color and not enough water, it won't work correctly either. So I've got plenty of color, just enough water. Get a pinch of salt and sprinkle it on. And you can immediately see the chemical reaction that's happening. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain fully what is happening. But essentially, the salt is pushing the pigment away from the salt. It is also at the same time soaking up some of the water. So it is absorbing some of the water and the color that's with it, and then simultaneously pushing more out and away from the salt. So it's really cool. And you can tell some areas where I had too much water, and so it's not quite reacting the way I want it to. Don't cover this though. We want to sprinkle it lightly. Next technique is plastic wrap. Similar to the salt, this is a good technique that works best with kind of darker colors. I'm going to go to blue this time. You can use any color that you want, by the way. Hopefully you haven't been completely copying my colors. Now, Crayola's really nice about getting plenty of pigment without too much water. Now, just because I have so much color, I dip my brush in more water to kind of pull this paint around because I don't need it to be any darker. All right, so before this dries, rinse my brush very quickly. I'm going to crinkle up my plastic wrap and just kind of dab and twist a little. All right, so that's a great way to get some texture. So you can see some of the paint is on the plastic wrap. Cool. And sometimes it's nice to actually get this when it's a little bit more dry and not so wet so that the paint doesn't go back to where it was. But it's a great way to get some cool textures. Next is lift/tissue. So it's similar to the plastic wrap. We're just using a paper towel, tissue, toilet paper, anything paper-based. So you can do this with a wet on wet technique. You can do this with wet on dry, which is your standard painting technique. As long as you have color. I love wet on wet. It's really fun. Just gonna let those blend a little. All right. So before that dries, I'm gonna get my tissue paper or paper towel. Kind of crumple it and press. Ooh, now I lifted too much that time. This is a great technique for making clouds in your sky. And then sometimes if you make a mistake, as long as you catch it before it's dry, you might be lucky enough to lift that much color. I didn't want to lift that much, so I'm just gonna fix it with a wet paintbrush. No more color. So the most important thing when you're doing these techniques is that you're not applying too much water because your paper is very delicate. You don't want to rip or tear the paper. So we have to be very, very careful. And you can see that plastic wrap technique, a lot of that paint went back into the grooves where it was. So I'm just going to get a little more. The more wrinkled it is, the better. There we go. And then sometimes you could even use it to stamp. So what I've seen occasionally is some artists will swirl a little bit of paint into the lid or another plate, lift the paint onto the plastic wrap, and then dab it on the paper to get some cool textures. So there's multiple ways that you can use this. It's been about 20 minutes and my layered wash is still kind of drying. So don't apply as much water as I did apparently. So I'm going to get another color, wet my paintbrush, wet the paint, and grab another color. And then I'm going to create my layered wash by pulling the paint across both parts. Now you can tell it's still a little wet because it's actually blending a little bit like a wet on wet technique, and that is not what I wanted. But it's very close. So now we just let that dry. Now that my layered wash is somewhat dry, I still have some area where there's a lot of water. I'm going to avoid that area. I'm going to do another layer of paint. And I'm going to try not to get so much paint. I'm going to dab a little off on the lid over here. You could do this on a paper towel if you need to. It's a great way to get off excess paint. So I'm going to do the other side of this facet now. Now that it's almost fully dry, you can actually see the difference between the layers here. So this is a great technique when you're just trying to get some uh, interesting color combinations. So here I'm just going to add some pure yellow. And I may do that again for another facet. So layered wash, just a really nice way to get some interesting colors. You do have to make sure that it's completely dry. So don't rush through this one. This technique might take you several hours, more than one class period, just because it needs to be completely dry for it to work correctly.